full of federal divisions would break up India. Well, Nehru was wrong, we know, because it was not a threat. You move on to a whole range of claims which later became the basis for dividing up existing states into smaller states. Right? Jharkhand, Telangana. Telangana is a very interesting case because if you now compare it with the Andhra case of the 50s, right? In the 50s, one might have thought, well, the regional demand, the cultural claim to autonomy has been resolved because we now have an Andhra state based on language. Well, Telangana comes up. I remember a time in the 1970s and 80s when the demand for Telangana, the demand for Jharkhand were opposed because the claim was these claims would simply lead to the breakup of the country. It didn't. Telangana is now a separate state. Jharkhand is now a separate state. Right? There is a demand, for instance, in Darjeeling for the Gorkha peoples to have their own state. Right? The interesting thing is that the present ruling party has been for the last 10 years representing Darjeeling in parliament. This same Gorkhaland movement is represented by a BJP MP. So you can think of how these kinds of claims actually work. The point therefore is that in each of these cases, whether it's Jharkhand, whether it's Telangana, whether it's Gorkhaland, everywhere the claim is that there is some fundamental injustice that is being done to a collective group which has its identity. There is some oppressor group outside which is oppressing it, and the claim is that this group must have the right to form its own political entity. In other words, sovereignty of the state, of the nation state, must be divided up further territorially. That sovereignty must be devolved to this oppressor group, to this currently oppressed group, in order to make it free, azad. You can connect this whole discussion to claims that are now being made in the Northeast, claims that is being made in Kashmir now. Of course, that's an old, more than 60 years that the problem in Kashmir has not been resolved. What I'm suggesting is that there is nothing special or supremely dangerous in these claims. These are claims that have been made, that are being negotiated right now. And the argument that somehow a claim to a separate identity, no matter what the specific form of the resolution, will depend on the politics that is allowed. If constitutional politics does not allow a certain kind of claim to be made, well, unconstitutional means will be taken. That is the nature of politics. But this is what I am arguing, that if in fact national self-determination is so obvious and sacrosanct, then the devolution of that sovereignty territorially within the nation state, within the boundaries of the nation state, cannot be opposed. That is a negotiation that continues, and it's a negotiation that ought to be allowed space. This, therefore, is the problem I have about people who say that any kind of talk of azadi in a collective sense is somehow anti-national, and advocating the breakup of the country is simply false. It is simply false. Because, as I've been saying, each single case from the time of the demand in the Tamil regions to Telangana to the linguistic states to all of the smaller states like Jharkhand and so on and so forth have all been based on essentially that same claim. Let's move on to something else that is relevant here. Which of course deals with the specific question of who it is that can declare a particular demand or claim as anti-national. Now, there is really no constitutional body or constitutional provision, right, which declares any kind of renegotiation of the terms of the constitution of the state as unconstitutional. There is no such thing. We have been told recently that somehow the constitution is inviolable. No question can be raised about the constitution. It's a very peculiar claim to make. Because if that is so, then no amendment of the constitution will be possible. Surely any amendment of the constitution will require questioning this or that provision of the constitution. Otherwise, why is ever a demand for a constitutional amendment made? As I said, every single claim of forming new states requires a constitutional amendment. It changes the constitution of the country. In fact, if you think of it, from 1947 or 1950, if you take the inauguration of the constitution as essentially forming the birth of the nation state as we know it, these changes in the internal constitution of the state itself has changed the nature of the nation state. The Indian nation state, as it was in the 1950s, is not what it is today. This is an entire historical process that has gone on and that will go on. The claim actually that is being made today, it seems to me, is not so much that there is a threat of any kind of breakup of the country. That is not the claim. What is being claimed by a ruling party is that we will define what is the content of the national, and we will identify people who will be put to the test of proving that they are not anti-national. That is what is being claimed. If you think of what is being attempted here, you will find this is completely compatible with the very definition of fascism. This is what fascist parties have always done. To identify people, target people, and then ask them to prove that they are not anti-national. If we move on to one final set of questions, issues, and then I will stop and you can take questions. which is the connection between what I spoke of as individual freedoms and these collective freedoms. Now, the individual freedoms and collective freedoms, I said, should be understood differently, but there is a connection between the two. Because the claim to individual freedoms cannot be pursued or asserted without a collective movement. This also is important to understand. Many of these individual freedoms, such as speech or movement or livelihood and so on and so forth, depend on things like income, occupation, status in society, right? Dignity. All of those are supports or bases for the pursuit of individual freedoms or the enjoyment of individual freedoms, right? There is no point in saying that one is free to associate if one does not even have the basic means of subsistence. These, therefore, form the foundations of the pursuit of a free life as free citizens. But these individual freedoms, which may in some cases be acquired individually, cannot have a permanent effect on society unless entire groups, entire classes, entire communities can attain those levels of income and livelihood and health and education and all of those things. The connection is there. So as a result, what appears to be individual freedoms actually have a foundation in the collective pursuit of those freedoms, to be able to combine with others in a movement, in a collective claim for better incomes, for education, for health, for a life of dignity. Now, this obviously relates to questions such as caste and class and gender, because those are inequalities, deep inequalities, which make the pursuit of individual freedoms sometimes impossible. We all know that, yes, there are individual cases where people from certain persons from extremely marginalized and impoverished backgrounds, communities, could improve their individual chances and attain that status of enjoying the freedoms that are offered by the Constitution, for instance. But those individual cases will not make a difference to the community as a whole, right? So as a result, the argument that the collective pursuit of these social and economic objectives is also a part of collective freedoms or collective azadi is a very, very valid argument. Without it, individual freedoms cannot be defended. So therefore, there is a connection here then between these kinds of inequalities, and sometimes in many of these cases there is actual oppression too. The difference with the cases we have spoken of earlier is that these kinds of relations of exploitation and oppression based on caste, for instance, or gender, cannot be resolved territorially. That is the crucial difference. You cannot have a territorial demarcation or a devolution of power and resolve the problem of caste inequality or caste oppression, because there is no territorial solution there. It requires a different set of resolutions within the territorial framework itself, whether at the state level, whether at the national level. These are questions of detail. But as I said, that even the question of individual freedom cannot be pushed forward without the question of resolving collective azadi, the question of collective azadi, not simply of the ones that have a territorial resolution, but of the others, which is questions of such as caste and gender and class. Finally, let me end by saying why in all of this, I think the university in particular has a very important role to play. In at least, well, maybe even 3 different senses. First of all, the university is the place where there is the full potential to collect and think about the knowledge of how people live, what people want, what people are claiming. All of these things can be observed and brought together in the form of analytical and systematically organized knowledge. That is the job of the university. This is not something that government departments can do. It is the university where this kind of collection of knowledge, that you might say knowledge of the country. It is the university where knowledge of the country is actually critically examined and thought about. Which is why the place of the university is particularly important here. The second is, of course, that it's in the university that you can have a critical engagement of different points of view over these questions of individual and collective freedoms. It is in the university which offers that place for a serious engagement and even debates, the kind of debates that would not be possible in the political battlefield or a television talk show, is possible in the university. And the third reason is, and this I think is a particularly important point in India, and especially for universities such as JNU, because the university is also a place where students, particularly students, but also teachers, from a variety of backgrounds, all of these different groups and communities and regions and so on that we have been talking about for so long, it is in the university that they come together. But not only do they come together in a place where knowledge, the serious pursuit of knowledge, is what people practice. In other words, what the university allows for is the bringing together within a single space where people speak or are encouraged to speak in a common language, the language of whatever discipline or whatever science is being pursued, speak a common language. People from different communities and regions and classes and castes come together and speak in that common language on a footing of equality. This is a particularly creative environment in which this kind of critical thinking about the country can be pursued. I do not think that there is any other institution in the country which offers quite this kind of environment. Which is why I think the assault that has come on the university is such a dangerous thing and should be resisted with all the force that we have. I will stop here. And I'll be very happy to take questions.